Hello, I'm Todd Kuchta. I'm a faculty member in the Department of English at Western Michigan University, and my talk is entitled The Climate of Partition, Khushwant Singh's Train to Pakistan. The Indian Partition of August 1947 split the British Raj into two separate nations, India and Pakistan. It is widely known that this split caused the largest and fastest migration in history, displacing some 14 million Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs in a matter of months. Largely forgotten is that this migration took place during a summer of extreme weather in the Punjab, the region most affected by partition. And you can see here that the Punjab was itself partitioned. The monsoon arrived 2 months late, after a protracted period of drought and severe heat. When the rains finally broke, they brought North India's worst floods in half a century, compounding the miseries of migration. These conditions allow us to view the partition as a climate emergency and its victims as climate migrants. Partition scholarship says very little about the weather, and partition literature written or translated into English even less. But eyewitness accounts, news reports, official correspondence, and meteorological data show how forcefully the weather affected the partition experience, particularly for migrants. I offer a composite sketch of its impact in what follows, then show how it informs Khushwant Singh's 1956 novel, Train to Pakistan, perhaps the only work of partition literature to foreground the climate emergency that accompanied the emergence of modern South Asia. First, a caveat about my claim that those displaced by partition were climate migrants. Of course, it was not drought or floods that made millions flee their homes in the summer of 1947. But as many have argued, extreme weather is rarely the sole cause of migration. In his book Tropic of Chaos, for example, Christian Parenti views climate change as one element in a catastrophic convergence, a collision of political, economic, and environmental disasters that compound and amplify each other. Rather than the single or primary source of migration, then, extreme weather is an accelerant that inflames and escalates existing social conflicts. The Indian Partition involved just such a convergence. Drought and flooding aggravated the political instability and communal tensions that spurred cross-border migration, a dilemma highlighted in Train to Pakistan. Ironically, partition occurred during one of South Asia's most moderate meteorological interludes in the last 150 years. But the summer of 1947 was an anomaly in the Punjab. Monsoon rains usually commence in June, but drought and unusually severe heat lasted until mid-August. In the preceding 5 months, temperatures across the province averaged 4 to 6 degrees above normal, the greatest deviation in British India, and the city of Lahore got a quarter inch of rain, a deficit of nearly 9 inches. In June and July, Lahore had 7 inches less rainfall than usual. New Delhi, on the Punjab's southeastern border, had almost that amount. Sir Radcliffe, the British lawyer tasked with drawing the Indian-Pakistan border in just 40 days, said his greater achievement was surviving that summer's heat. In a catastrophic convergence of extreme weather and communal tension, the high temperatures and lack of rain primed the Punjab for months of arson. From April to July, there were 600 fires in Lahore alone. In May, shade temperatures reached 110 degrees. In June, night temperatures rarely fell below 100. Baked by the dry heat, wooden houses in Lahore's walled city burned like tinder. Auspiciously, the drought began to break up on August 15th, India's Independence Day. A brief but dramatic shower accompanied the unfurling of India's flag in New Delhi, and you can see on this image the rather cloudy skies. I have here a map of the Punjab, which is cut down the center by the partition line, but that also highlights the rivers, which are going to become really important in what follows. So days after the Independence Day celebration, terrific storms outside Lahore made the River Ravi unfordable for refugees, while heavy rains in Amritsar left many roads impassable. In the last week of August, a cyclonic storm brought widespread, locally heavy rain to East Punjab, flooding rivers and cutting lines of communication and transport. At an airbase outside Jalandhar, Indian Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru waded knee-deep water to reach his ground transport. But worse was yet to come. After a 3-week lull, heavy rain swept across the partitioned Punjab in the last 10 days of September, when the monsoon should have been retreating. Hoshiarpur saw 60 hours of steady downpour. New Delhi got nearly 12 inches of rain, 7 inches above the month's average, and double that of the preceding 6 months. All of the Punjab's rivers burst their banks, causing North India's worst floods since 1900. The Ravi submerged 1/4 of Lahore for 2 days, leaving over 100,000 homeless and washing away 120 neighboring villages. The Sutlej covered parts of Firozpur in 4 to 6 feet of water, and more than half the city's buildings collapsed. The Beas swelled to 10 miles across, 20 times its normal breadth, and raised a bridge near Gurdaspur. A flooded powerhouse left Amritsar and over a dozen other towns in darkness for a week. And outside Delhi, the rising Yamuna left thousands of villagers homeless. Migration ceased as rain washed away roads, railway lines, and bridges, including miles of the legendary Grand Trunk Road north and south of Jalandhar. And you can see on this map how the Grand Trunk Road in red intersects or cuts across so many of the Punjab's rivers. The Times estimated 10,000 people were ruined by water, covering hundreds of square miles of countryside. Other reports claimed the Ravi stranded 300,000 and the Beas 100,000, while hundreds of thousands more were trapped along the Grand Trunk Road. The rains likely lessened the bloodshed, but exposed migrants to further danger. Flooding hindered efforts to recover abducted women. Downpours doused cooking fires, leaving many migrants hungry, exposed, and prone to disease. Stagnant water spread cholera in refugee camps. And even as the rain ceased, huge swaths of the Punjab remained inundated. Large-scale migration didn't resume until early October. Remarkably, the late rains and record floods of 1947 are virtually absent from the canon of partition literature in English. But they play a central role in Khushwant Singh's Train to Pakistan, the first and still most famous partition novel. Extreme weather shapes the novel's imagery, atmosphere, and plot, allowing Singh to explore the horrors of partition, particularly for migrants. Rather than simply pitting humans against random acts of nature, however, Singh depicts partition violence as a catastrophic convergence of extreme weather and human agency. In this sense, we might read his novel as a prototype of contemporary climate fiction. Train to Pakistan is driven by meteorological anomalies and disturbances. It begins, quote, "The summer of 1947 was not like other Indian summers. Even the weather had a different feel in India that year. It was hotter than usual and drier and dustier. And the summer was longer. No one could remember when the monsoon had been so late," unquote. Even when Singh turns to the partition violence, as he does right after this opening passage, his account reads a bit like a weather report. Quote, "Riots spread north and east and west across India, mimicking a storm's trajectory. Columns of Hindus and Sikhs, quote, collided, unquote, with Muslims, like fronts of competing weather systems." Now, post-colonial theory might critique such language as the prose of counterinsurgency, Ranjit Guha's term for the discourse that likens acts of subaltern violence to, quote, natural phenomena. They break out like thunderstorms, heave like earthquakes, spread like wildfires, end quote. But the Anthropocene insists on the entangling of human and natural forces. So if Singh's meteorological motifs risk naturalizing partition violence, they also show how such violence emerged from a convergence of political and environmental disasters. Consider the novel's setting and plot. Train to Pakistan takes place in a fictional village called Mano Majra on the Indian side of a newly partitioned Punjab. Comprised equally of Muslims and Sikhs, the village sits half a mile from the Sutlej River on the railway line between Delhi and Lahore, which I have highlighted on this map. By placing the village where river and border are one, Singh shows that the partition was both a political division and what environmental historian David Gilmart calls a division of nature. Spanning the riparian border is a railway bridge that is crucial to the plot, in which a Hindu magistrate must transfer the village Muslims to Pakistan. But the villagers are unaware of the violence around them, so the Muslims are reluctant to go, and the Sikhs are reluctant to make them. The weather compounds the dilemma. When the monsoon breaks, the flooded river will prevent migration, except via the titular train to Pakistan. Climate and landscape are thus crucial players in the political drama. The magistrate's task becomes more urgent when a train pulls into the village carrying 1,000 corpses that he must cremate, victims of partition violence. But this horrific scene, filtered through the magistrate's perspective, gives way to an even more vivid passage, an extended account of the coming monsoon. Placed squarely at the novel's center, this 4-page set piece is a caesura in the plot, a lyrical pause that transcends narrative logic. Yet it clearly evokes the magistrate's memories of the corpse train and the cremation afterwards. Though the partition is never mentioned, every line here evokes it, as if it were the insistent but unspoken referent. And now I'm going to compare language from these two passages. Before the rain, fissures in the dry earth open their gaping mouths, like the massacre victims that Chand, the name of the magistrate, sees with mouths still open in voiceless shrieks. The bare branches of withered trees stretch up to the sky, begging for water, like the dying man whose hand stretched itself grotesquely towards Chand. The sun sears the grass and thorny scrub till they catch fire, and the wind carries the flames, like the breeze that blows the smell of searing flesh to the village. Chand, the magistrate's appearance and behavior after the cremation also parallel the phases of the monsoon. He looks weary and haggard, just as those awaiting rain look up wearily to the sky. He gulps whiskey, like one who hopes to drink deep with the rain, then feels relaxed and pleasantly tired. But this numbness is like heat stroke, which makes the head nod and the eyes heavy. He's momentarily refreshed by a bath and a punka's cool breeze, recalling the gentle breeze and flush of enthusiasm that accompany the first rains. But his relief is short-lived, as when an endless downpour makes the earth, quote, a big stretch of swamp and mud, unquote. As with partition, then, the tempo of life and death increases with the monsoon. After the rains, the ground is strewn with wriggling insects, recalling the dead bodies crammed and jammed together in the train. And the night air is filled with myriads of moths burning themselves in the flames of candles, like the 1,000 charred corpses that were cremated. If comparing massacre and monsoon in this way risks naturalizing partition violence, the ensuing narrative shows humans working purposely with nature, both to prevent and to commit further violence. The morning after the cremation, the magistrate, Chand, wakes to the breaking monsoon. Fearing a flood will jeopardize the Muslim evacuation, he takes a cue from nature: bow before the storm till it passes. Rather than forcing the Muslims out, he foments communal mistrust, sowing suspicion among the village Sikhs, like a peasant planting seeds with the first rains. To show that his scheme worked, this planting motif occurs when military trucks, plowing their way through the slush and mud, take the Muslims to a refugee camp before transport to Pakistan. They leave the village in a downpour that compounds the chaos. In the confusion of rain, mud, and soldiers herding the peasants about, their property is left to local thieves. But as the river floods, natural and human violence converge in more sinister ways. Villagers had never known the river to rise so high so quickly, and one of them suspects sluice gates were closed upstream, intensifying the deluge. But a night watch of the rising water reveals even worse. In the muffled moonlight, the river is, quote, a sheet of black, unquote. So the men on watch see nothing but the swirling water, though they hear distant cries. When the clouds break and the rains slow, they discern shapes, dark shapes floating downstream: dead cattle, bundles of thatch and clothes, and eventually human corpses. One man thinks a village was, quote, swept away by the flood overnight, end quote, a fitting analog for the partition itself, which swiftly displaced entire communities. But as the sun rises, the men see dead bulls hitched to wagons in the river. Who yokes bulls to carts at night, one asks. The men now realize the corpses were not drowned, they were murdered. What initially appears the result of a natural disaster is in fact, quote, a massacre, end quote, an orchestrated act of communal violence facilitated but not caused by the flood. The point is reinforced by a victim whose outstretched arms and gaping mouth recall visions from the corpse train that haunt the magistrate. Time is short, so I will jump to the novel's conclusion. The magistrate discovers a Sikh plan to attack the train with the village Muslims as it crosses the bridge into Pakistan. The Sikhs aim to tie a rope across the bridge's first span so that as the train passes, hundreds perched atop the cars will be cut into or topple to their deaths. In desperation, the magistrate releases a fearsome Sikh prisoner from jail, hoping that his love for a Muslim girl on the train and his imposing presence will somehow foil the attack. And it does. The novel ends with the prisoner frantically cutting the rope and falling to his death, crushed by the speeding train. And this plot sounds more contrived than I've had to make it by trying to compress it into this little explanation. But before the prisoner's unexpected sacrifice, he asks a Sikh priest for a blessing. The prayer, which claims God prefers deeds that bore fruit to those that never ripen, frames the prisoner's sacrifice as part of a larger cycle of planting and harvesting. Saving the train to Pakistan is thus the successful culmination to the late monsoon. Earlier, the prisoner's lover rebuked him as an oversexed peasant, quote, always wanting to sow your seed, she says to him. But in the end, the prisoner's sacrifice symbolically ensures that the monsoon will bear fruit in the form of safe passage for the Muslim migrants. In doing so, Singh's novel seeks to redeem the partition's catastrophic convergence of natural and political disasters. Thank you.